China, the most populous country in the world. Everywhere you look, there are people, lots and lots of them. I was born and raised in China. Part of my childhood was in an era when the country was mostly isolated from the rest of the world. Our only allies back then were a handful of socialist countries like North Korea, Albania, Romania, and Yugoslavia. I remember because the only foreign films we saw were from those countries. I don't know what people elsewhere would swear on in those days, but when we were little, we would often in private conversations swear on these big names. 马恩列斯毛. The earliest American names I learned were 基辛格, 尼克松. I didn't even know how to say Kissinger and Nixon in English until much later. I was 8 years old when President Nixon visited China in 1972. I lived in Shanghai, where the Shanghai Joint Communique was issued on February 27th. Nixon's visit marked the first time a U.S. president had visited China in 25 years. Both sides were extremely cautious about the ice-breaking trip. It was such a huge deal in China that the whole country was mobilized to get prepared. I remember a 16-word policy in case we were approached by one of those nosy and tricky American reporters. Streets in Beijing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai were thoroughly cleaned. Hanging clothes outside for air dry was forbidden. Curfew was imposed. Everything was carefully orchestrated and tightly controlled because we wouldn't want to take any chances. It was years later, when I watched some documentaries, did I realize that how big of a deal it was for the Americans as well. To mark the 40th anniversary of Nixon's trip to China, on March 7, 2012, some key players in the U.S.-Chinese relationship spoke at this symposium. What I found most interesting was that in Nixon's memoir, he wrote, when I read that, I thought, little did he know that in order not to make the streets look so deserted, certain people were chosen to form make-believe families to stroll the streets. I happened to be a kid in one of those fake families. We gathered at Shanghai No. 3 Camera Factory, where from a selected group of people, they would randomly pair up a young man and a woman plus a child to look like a family. Every few minutes or so, a family was dispatched to walk down the street toward a public swimming pool about half a mile away and then walked back. As a child, I didn't quite understand what all the fuss was about. Even though I didn't get to meet Nixon himself, I was just incredibly excited for the opportunity of getting a glimpse of those very important Americans. In fact, people living in the buildings along the streets the motorcade would pass were specifically instructed to open 1/3 of their windows. The rest of the windows had to remain shut. People were told to wave slightly at the open windows because big waves would have indicated too much enthusiasm. Now that I have lived in America most of my adult life, looking back, I can't help but think that once the barriers were removed and walls torn down, the windows that were even slightly open cannot be closed again.
Great future. My hope is that in the future, perhaps as a result of the beginning that we have made on this journey, that many, many Americans, particularly the young Americans who like to travel so much, will have an opportunity to come here as I have come here today with Mrs. Nixon and the others in our party. That they will be able to see this wall, that they will think back as I think back to the history of this great people, and that they will have an opportunity, as we have had an opportunity, to know the Chinese people and know them better. And I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this, or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world. That peoples, regardless of their differences in backgrounds and their philosophies, will have an opportunity to communicate with each other, to know each other, and to share with each other those particular endeavors that will mean peaceful progress in the years ahead. So, all in all, I would say finally we've come a long way to be here today, 16,000 miles, and many things that have occurred in this trip have made me realize that it was worth coming. But I would say, as I look at the wall, it's worth coming 16,000 miles just to stand here and see the wall.